For Station 3, we're going to look at the framework for teaching and how that can align to the assessment cycle. We're going to start with a question with this station. So how does your LEA incorporate the framework for teaching into the assessment cycle? So with the framework for teaching, we use this in many of our LEAs evaluation processes. Some may use something other than the Danielson model, but the idea will be the same. When we look at what goes into planning and preparation, what could be connected to the cycle of assessment? What could be connected into Domain 2, the classroom environment? What could be connected to Domain 3, instruction? And what could be connected to Domain 4, professional responsibilities? So as you start thinking about, well, what do I have to do to prepare for assessment? Well, I need to know the content and pedagogy. What content will I be teaching? At what level will I be teaching it? And then how will that play into the assessment that I give? What do I need to know about my students? Are they prepared? And in this example, are they prepared to take the CDT? Do they know the tools that will be used? Do they know the expectations and what types of questions they'll see? Content that they may not have been exposed to before. We move on to Domain 2. So, how have I created an environment of respect and rapport? Have I communicated that to my students that all students have areas of strength and all students have areas to grow upon? Have I established that culture for learning where everybody is setting goals? How will I manage my space? What are my procedures that I use during assessment? Let's move on to Domain 3 for some more examples. When I am instructing, how have I used questioning and discussion techniques to help my students prepare for the assessment? How have I engaged my students in learning? Have I demonstrated flexibility and responsiveness? Have I differentiated instruction to meet students' needs? I always need to teach a grade level content, but in my intervention or my small group differentiation, have I provided enrichment or intervention that scaffolds students to meet grade level expectations or exceed grade level expectations? And then in Domain 4, professional responsibilities, have I maintained accurate records? Do I actually know what my students are capable of doing? Have I communicated with families the progress of students? Have I shared the data with others in a professional learning community? So the assessment cycle can overlay into the framework for teaching. And it would even behoove us to think about how an administrator or a coach or a colleague could look at what we're doing in the classroom and use that to gather evidence for our effectiveness as an educator who also uses assessment and thinks about each of the domains as they plan for the assessment cycle. So here's an example of a classroom diagnostic tool walkthrough checklist with some of those overlays. For example, under the top left-hand column, prepared students for assessment by explaining how the computer adaptive test works. That ties to element 2B, establish a culture for learning. The one right below that, management of testing environment. Things like test tickets are prepared. Accommodations have been pre-selected. I've made a plan for early finishers that aligns to element 2C, managing classroom procedures. And you can see there are other examples of the one-to-one conference that ties to element 2D in what I've shared on the screen there. Students completed metacognition template prior to the conference. Moving over to the right-hand side of the screen, use of multiple assessment data to customize instruction. That ties to element 1F, designing student assessments. You see the pattern. We have thought about each of the stages of the assessment cycle and tied that to a walkthrough checklist that has an overlay of educator effectiveness elements. So again, I pose that question to you. How has your LEA intertwined educator effectiveness with the assessment cycle?